So good afternoon, everybody. This is the recording of NIA's last Regulatory Priorities webinar of 2019. Many of you will be familiar with these webinars, so I will quickly run through what we're going to do today and the role that NIA plays in this. As you know, and many of you that have been involved in our previous webinars, we, as the name suggests, we are the Industrial Association for Nanotechnologies and Materials worldwide, and we support all aspects of commercial development of nanomaterials and technologies. And our three main areas of activity in order to do that are the development of a very robust regulatory framework, and this is particularly important now as information on nanomaterials and nanoform becomes into focus and starts to shape the regulatory frameworks, not only in the EU, but all over the world and across all sectors. So we work with our members to inform how those regulatory webinars can be developed for maximum commercial capability and also retaining as much safety as possible. And we also work to support our members in understanding where they fit into regulatory frameworks and their pathway to market access. We also do an increasing amount of business and scientific networking and promotion for members because it's a very small world within nano and everybody has something really interesting to offer. So we have members that work across all types of materials, applications, sectors and countries, and it's always a pleasure to help promote them into new potential business opportunities. And finally, we work within EU projects and with national and international government frameworks to help develop an aligned and robust ecosystem for nanotechnology to develop. We've grown really well in 2019. We have over 50 members now, and they span the whole range of the ecosystem for nanomaterials technologies. So lots and lots of small and large industry are involved, an increasing number of research organisations, particularly market-facing research centres, and of course our invaluable expert services members who really help to bring a depth of knowledge and their own expertise into all aspects of our work. So of course, as always, I will say, if you don't belong to NIA, you should of course belong to NIA. So come and talk to me after the webinar if you would like to find out more. So today, as we get to work, we are looking across a number of different areas for nanomaterials development, particularly around the regulatory. So, of course, ECHA is top of the list with the REACH Annex updates inbound for January. We're going across into food with EFSA before touching briefly on the OECD. And then we're looking at specific other sectors and materials which have been in the news recently. And we'll wrap up with work that we've been doing recently on developing a position on the terminology in use around nanoplastics and taking a quick look forward to 2020 for activities that we have in the pipeline, which are open to both members and our wider community. So I'm going to hand over to David now and be quiet, you'll be pleased to know, and we look forward to speaking to you at the end of the webinar. So take it away, David.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon or good morning to wherever you are. So getting into the various topics, we're starting off with the first, and this should be hopefully no news to anyone, that we have a regulation from end of 2018 that enters now into force. No, well, it should be applicable. You should applied from 1st of January 2020, and this is indeed where several of the REACH annexes have been updated to include specific information for nanomaterials. And on the next slide, this is just a selection of the classic one, what industries now need to provide as specific information when they are characterizing the physicochemical properties of the nanoforms of the substances that they are registering under REACH. So obviously name and identifier of the substance, the particle size distribution, and that should be a number particle size distribution, looking at the surface treatment and the surface functionalization of the particle, of the nanoform, the shape morphology, the surface area, and as well not not to say the least, provide some information about the analytical methods that have been used to provide this information. Certainly, the REACH annexes are also, this is just REACH Annex 6, but once you get into the more nitty-gritty details in the annexes related to the tonnage, so for annual production more than 1 ton up to 1,000 ton, more specific requirements are indeed also needed, but I will not go into those details at this point in time. So next slide, please. So this is just to move over to the ECHA Nanoforms guidance, which is indeed a support for the regulation. So the next slide. And I do apologize, I have a bit of a cold, so that maybe can come through once in a while. Very importantly, over the last year, ECHA, during its partner expert group process, have developed a new guidance. It's an appendix for nanoforms applicable to the guidance on registration and substance identification. So they have the ECHA, as you may already be aware, they have their main guidance document, the guidance on registration and substance identification, which in turn has a number of subsection and appendices. And this is the appendix that was now published in the public official version now in December, on the 3rd of December, well of 28 days ahead of the deadline when industries will have to use it. Previous versions of this guidance have been published already, and together with NIA members, we've had a detailed NIA members webinar on this. So I will not go into too much detail. Obviously, it is also publicly available, so you can have a more detailed look if you want to, or indeed also come back to us. But on the next slide, just a short overview of what it contains. Obviously, you have the introduction, the general considerations, talk about nanoforms. Nanoforms is the term used now in the regulation for what is a normal in the old 2011 recommendation, the nanomaterial and nanoform. So a nanoform can form a subset of a substance, and you know that REACH is applicable to substances. Very interestingly, and will also be useful for industries, is the possibilities to create sets of nanoforms, but this is not immediately straightforward, but it allows to set boundaries around sets for the various physical parameters and be able to use common sets of data during the registration. And chapter 5 is indeed how to do the practical approach to actually do the joint submissions and how to submit the information to ECHA when dossiers are updated. Next slide, please. So going into just one of these chapters of the guidance document, the general considerations, the important thing is, of course, that now the regulation amending REACH to address nanoforms of substances makes it explicit that nanoforms of a substance need to be covered by the registration dossier. So if you are a manufacturer of a nanoform and you have joined already a sieve, or you have interest to joining what's replacing on the sieve, the substance information exchange form that is not really in place anymore, or you request a letter of access, this is very important. If you're producing a nanoform of a substance, it needs to be covered by the registration dossier. And the appendix, the nanoform guidance, indeed provides a lot of details and advice to register on what nanoforms are, how to characterize them, and how to build a set of nanoforms, and how to report identify nanoforms and sets of nanoforms in section 1.2 of the registration dossier, and how to do that in the IOCLID system, because IOCLID, the dossier submission, electronic submission system, has also been updated to be able to consider nanoforms. Next slide, please. So moving over to the next guidance document, the ECHA guidance on QSAR and grouping. So next slide, please. This was This guidance is actually version 2, because the first version of this guidance document was published in 2017. But now it has been updated to also consider nanoforms. So next slide, please. I'll spend a few more slides on this one. The main chapters in this appendix, this guidance document is, well, you have the introduction and the aim of the guidance document, and the grouping approach in chapter 3, where a stepwise strategy for grouping and read across of nanoforms for the purpose of hazard and fate identification is outlined in a 7-step process. However, this guidance does not deal with the creation of the sets of nanoforms. For the creation of the sets of nanoforms, you have to refer to the previous guidance document just mentioned, because this one exclusively refers to read across. And although it's in the name that it also looks at QSAR, there is no specific advice for QSARs and nanoforms in the guidance document. And basically that's the origin to that is that there's very limited at the moment, very limited information on how to do qualitative structure activity relationships for nanoforms. So next slide, please. So this outlines the 7-step process to do the grouping and read across for nanoforms for the purpose of hazard and fate identification. So the issues, you start by selection of the target nanoforms, and you do a read across, and then you have to, of course, always justify why this is possible and doable. And in the next slide, there's a bit more detail on the 7 steps, and basically they make a rather logical approach. So you start by identifying and characterize the nanoforms and sets that you have. You do an initial grouping of your nanoforms. You do develop a read across hypothesis, and you look at the group's boundaries and what you would consider be a justifiable group. And then you would gather all the available data for each group member, and you evaluate them for adequacy and reliability, always issue of reliability and how to be able to justify the use of the data. And then once you have the data, you look at your suggested to make a matrix of the data availability, and then in step 5 you assess the adequacy and the approach to fill the data gaps within the group. And then by step 6 you actually perform or you propose testing to fill the data gaps. So sometimes you may be able to just perform the testing to fill the data gaps that you have identified, or sometimes due to REACH you may also have to propose testing to ECHA to get it approved. And then of course, as always, you need to document the finalized grouping approach and refine the grouping rationale should it not be successful at this point in time. It may be that you have to do more detailed subsets of forms or sets. So next slide, please. And this is now slightly moving away from the guidance document, just a bit of a promoting ECHA here. They did have a webinar on 12th of November where they discussed the revised REACH information requirements for nanoforms. And the webinar, the ECHA webinar is available also, but what was not available at that point in time is there was a full question and reply session going on at the same time. And for NIA members, we have collected all these questions and replies, and they are available for the ECHA webinar, from the ECHA webinar to NIA members after logging into the restricted members area. And some of the questions and replies were certainly rather interesting and detailed and to see how ECHA replied on this. ECHA indicated that they may actually do a sort of report on the questions and replies, but to my understanding, that is not, at least not yet been published, but we have it for the NIA members already. Next slide, please. What's also a bit related to these whole aspects of REACH and regulations, the European Observatory on Nanomaterials, also run and managed by ECHA, they have published a very useful table overview of REACH information requirements and available methods for nanomaterials. So they have specified under the first column for the endpoints the applicable a description of the endpoint for nanoforms and what REACH annexes it is. This is just the first. The table is rather long, as you can understand, because this one only mentions REACH Annex 6, but of course there's also REACH Annex 7, 8, 9, and 10, and 11, where specific aspects are considered. What we have also done for NIA members, we have, as you can see on this slide, we have an additional, the last column, and NIA additional information on methods, where intel that we have as NIA being part of for example, at the OECD, or at the European projects, we have some more information on the status of the specific methods. Because unfortunately, we have a guidance document for ECHA now, but we do not have validated standardized methods for all of the parameters that are requested in the regulation. So that, of course, presents a bit of a difficulty for industries now, not to least to say in the 1st of January deadline. And the view of ECHA is that, well, industries should provide as much information as they can, irrespective if the method is valid or not. So there are possibilities that allow for that in the IOCLID submission format. Next slide, please. So also what ECHA is doing, obviously this is not specific now for nanomaterials, but part of their general process to assess and evaluate the chemical substances. They every year provide a community rolling action plan, and the draft community rolling action plan for the years 2020 to 2022, the 3 years, was published on October, and where 76 entries are indicated in the list, and 60 substances are to be evaluated in 21, 22, and 14 during 2020. So in total 74. And in the list, the first list that was published a number of years ago, like 5 years ago, there was even some initial grounds for concern whether you just specified nanomaterials. Happily now, that is not a concern anymore, just being a nanomaterial or having a nanoform. But it's just important to know that there are substances in the CORAP list that are known to have a nanoform. For example, serum dioxide that will be evaluated by Germany in 2021, and carbon black that will be evaluated by France in 2022. And just the final point here, the ECHA aims to adopt and publish the final CORAP for 2020 to 2022 on 18th of March next year. That's the schedule that ECHA itself has been given us. Next slide, please. So moving over to another European agency, the European Food Safety Authority, and some of the most recent mandates, so really changing from chemicals to food and food contact materials. Next slide, please. EFSA has a register of questions, and scanning that regularly, we have identified a number of recent mandates. So this first one is a mandate. It's actually quite old, but it was accepted. It originated only in 2016, but it was accepted here now by the end of August this year. And this is an implementation and validation of analytical methodology to assess the presence of nanoparticles in food additives, E171, 174, and 175. So that will be titanium dioxide, silver, and gold. And this project, and this is, I think, the reason why it's just been accepted, is that it will be performed likely under a procurement. So EFSA will launch a call for a procurement procedure, and then the one who wins that procurement will perform and write up an external scientific report that eventually will be published in the EFSA journal at the finalization of the project. strangely enough, and after being in some contact with ECHA, sorry, with EFSA, they have actually not, because they usually make these mandates the information more public, but for this they have not yet uploaded the actual documentation, but I expect them to do that. I think with just a human error at the moment, because I have been in contact and with the EFSA for this, getting some updates. Next slide, please. Which is also related to an EFSA exercise, and this is to develop a technical guidance. EFSA have just, again, by the end of October, they accepted this request from the European Commission, and it's for EFSA to develop a scientific opinion on the guidance on technical requirements of regulated food and feed product applications to establish the presence of particles in the nanoscale. And what does this mean in practice? Well, it originates to some extent by the engineered nanomaterial definition we have now under the 2015 novel food regulation, where we talk where an engineered nanomaterial means an intentionally produced material, and we're talking about dimensions in the order of 100 nanometers or less. As you are possibly aware, there are a few different definitions. So what has happened here is when an application, so this request originated from the European Commission, obviously also in discussion with the EFSA, who have had some, from an industrial perspective, some very broad interpretation what constitutes a nanomaterial in the latest guidance document. So when an application concerns a conventional material which does not meet the definition of engineered nanomaterial, but may contain small particles, including particles at the nanoscale. So this is for the technical guidance to look at. So the technical guidance should develop a process to demonstrate whether a portion or the whole of the material is in the nanoscale. So again, I think we're seeing here a bit of a clash between the different definitions developed by the European Commission, the one in food, engineered nanomaterials, the one we have in cosmetics, which talks about insoluble biopersistent materials, and the definition we have now for nanoforms in REACH, originating from the 2011 recommendation. But this technical guidance development is expected to be, well, it should be finalized according to the request by the end of 2020, and that is also, they hope it to be published at the same time as the finalization of the EFSA guidance document for food and feed. That is still sort of under doing a test trial under 1 year now. Next slide, please. This is coming over to what's happening from my point of view. I think it's very, very interesting, and it's for applications that have been received by EFSA for actual products, to be putting products onto the market. And 3 requests have been asked for plastic food contact material uses, and they are all for inclusion into Annex 1 of Regulation 10/2011, which is the plastic food contact materials. So one is from one of our members. It's a request for safety evaluation of silver as a nanomaterial by RAS Materials. This mandate was accepted just now, like 2 weeks ago, and EFSA now has 6 months to provide their opinion, unless there is a time clock procedure to ask for more information. But if that is not happening, an opinion is expected by May next year. And then we have 2 requests related to calcium carbonate. They come from the Calcium Carbonate Association. The mandates were also just accepted in like 2 weeks ago. So also here, should the 6-month time frame should be respected by EFSA, unless additional information is requested. We should expect to see some opinions by end of May next year. And the first one here is for nanoprecipitated calcium carbonate, and the second one is for fatty acid coated nanoprecipitated calcium carbonate. And again, all of these mandates are for to be used as additives in plastic food contact materials. And for example, we have the first one, the safety evaluation of silver. We, as an NIA, as an industry association supporting one of our members, we have supported RAS in developing and scrutinizing their application. So we're looking forward to see the EFSA outcome for this opinion by the late spring next year. Next slide, please. And we're shifting over to a bit of OECD activities. So next slide. This is just to mention some of the OECD, as I'm sure you are aware, has a working party of manufactured nanomaterials. Sorry, excuse me, I just need to sort out my throat. Just having a drink of tea. The OECD have since quite some time in the working party of manufactured nanomaterials developed, revised and updated a number of the OECD test guidelines. Some test guidelines are already applicable for nanomaterials and some have been recently updated, but there are also some test guidelines that are under the process to be developed and revised to consider nanoforms. And one part of this exercise is done in the European project Gov4Nano, especially in Work Package 2, which is sometimes also referred to as the Malta project, which is a European support to the OECD to develop the OECD guidance documents and test guidelines. And the Gov4Nano is working on 7 tasks, started in 1st of January. And we should all be aware that developing these test guidelines takes a couple of years. So we are not expecting to have these finalized just yet. But once they are published as OECD test guidelines, they, of course, and this is one of the benefits, they fall under the OECD mutual acceptance of data. So data and information you get from performing your testing under the OECD test guidelines is that you can use the information for a number of international jurisdictions, such as for Canada, US, Japan, Korea, etc., without having to repeat the testing. So very briefly, the tasks that are ongoing for Gov4Nano is the solubility and dissolution rate. We're looking at surface chemistry and coatings, harmonized test guidelines for the volume-specific surface area, in vitro skin sensitization, looking at dustiness, abiotic transformation, and bioaccumulation of nanomaterials in fish. Also, not on a specific slide, but just to mention that a follow-up project under the acronym NanoHarmony have just been starting the negotiation phase by the European Commission to start working, to continue work on some of these methods, as well as on some new OECD test guidelines to be developed, all in support of the OECD. That was, and this NanoHarmony project is expected to start early spring next year. And NIA, we are, as an industry association, we are heavily involved in both of these projects, both in Gov4Nano, not only Work Package 2, but also part of the next projects, the NanoHarmony project, to ensure that we have a good input from the industries into, and have industry experts in working with the development of these test guidelines and guidance documents for the OECD. Next slide, please. Where I think we're moving over to cosmetics, so we can just jump into the next slide immediately. Rather recently, the Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety published their updated, also here, it's not something completely new, guidance document on the safety assessment of nanomaterials in cosmetics. there was a previous guidance document existing, but based on the experience of the Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety opinions that they have performed over the years, they have learned a number of important lessons. So in this new updated guidance document, there is further emphasis on physical characterization as well as exposure assessment, as well as on the use of alternative methods for hazard assessment, because we do recall that for cosmetics, animal testing on animals is not allowed specifically for cosmetics. That is not to say that in certain instances, if you have results from other regulatory required uses of animals, such as under REACH, you may also use that information for cosmetics. The guidance document also includes the updated revised section on coatings and nanocarriers, encapsulation, immune toxicity, grouping, and read across. And although there is a specific definition of for nanomaterials in the cosmetics regulation from 2009, the Scientific Committee on Consumer Safety here in this guidance document also urges applicants to consider the 2011 recommendation when they are addressing their own materials. Next slide, please. This is also related to cosmetics, and it's the updated European Commission catalogue of nanomaterials in cosmetics. The version 2 of this catalogue was published on 15th November, now 2019. The previous version was published in 2017-16, if I'm taking that from the top of my head, about 2 years ago. And the catalog lists 29 types of nanomaterials with various types of functions in cosmetics, and there are basically 3 functions as colorants, UV filters, or other functions. And also this catalog is required by the 2009 regulation to create this and have this catalog published regularly. It's stated that less than 1.5% of cosmetic products were notified to contain nanomaterials. Also important for nanomaterials using cosmetics is that they have to be labeled, and we do see a number of useful labeling of nanomaterials, for example, when used as UV filters in sunscreens. Next slide, please. Titanium dioxide and classification. Yes, so just a slide or two on this. This is related to the CLP regulation, the classification, labeling, and packaging regulation, where the history is that in May 2016, France put forward a classification proposal for titanium dioxide. This was handled in 2017. The ECHA Risk Assessment Committee published their opinion. And since 2017, there's been a number of regulatory discussions in the Caracal Committee, composed of European Commission and member states. And then about 2 months ago, the European Commission adopted a classification proposal as titanium dioxide is a suspect carcinogen in category 2 for inhalation. However, with a number of derogations in the regulation, in the proposal itself, made as several notes. And it's currently on the 2-month scrutiny period by the Council and Parliament, and there has been some discussions in the news as well on this. The classification is solely related to when you have the material in a powdered form containing 1% or more of smaller than 10 micrometer titanium dioxide. And some of the derogations is just briefly indicated here when solid and liquid mixtures are not classified. However, they need warning labels. And there has been, if we move to the next slide, there are indeed some concerns on this proposal. Can have downstream implications as it may impact the circular economy, such as for waste recycling, may also impact other regulations such as for cosmetics and toys and so forth. And basically it could actually create misleading labels where a product has to be labeled as with a warning label, but the only hazard is if this titanium dioxide would be in an inhalable form. So, and the origin of this is, you may have heard, it's based on a rather poorly designed animal study with an overload exposure. And also now in the scientific domain, there is ongoing scientific discussion on how to measure and assess an overload situation in an animal. But this study was in rats, and there is a fundamental biological difference in the clearance mechanism between humans and rats, as well as between rats and other animals. So there are indeed some concerns. However, people are also arguing that, well, based on the current regulation and the way the current regulation is written, there was not much else that RAC could do, or the European Commission could do. However, the issue here is that the hazard is actually not an intrinsic substance effect, but it's a particle effect, and the CLP should not be for should be a classification due to the substance effect. So there is a concern that this may set a precedent for similar classification for other poorly soluble, low toxicity substances. And an estimate that there are around 300 of such substances. So I'm sure we're not seeing the end of this story. And obviously, from an industry perspective, we have for a long time, industries, we have managed to work with the powders and dusts, and we know that there are issues with dust. So other measures would indeed have seemed a lot more appropriate, for example, to create a harmonized occupational exposure levels to manage the occupational setting of dusty environments where titanium dioxide in a powdered form where there is possibilities for inhalation would be would happen. Next slide, please. And we're moving again to one of the last topics for our webinar, moving into nanoplastics and the NIA position. Next slide, please. The origin of this position is there are a number of recent publications starting basically not with nanoplastics, but with the word microplastics, and I'm sure you have heard that quite a lot recently. And also the European Commission itself is using the term nanoplastics in what, from our perspective as an industry association, we think it's a bit unfortunate, and we would like to have a bit more clarifications on what is referred when you talk about nanoplastics. So the next slide. You may be aware that ECHA was asked by the European Commission to start working on microplastics, and this is a proposal from ECHA to do an Annex 15 restriction report for microplastics. And here we're not talking about microplastics found in the oceans, but we're talking about microplastic found in the oceans, which is from a degradation of larger plastics. But we're talking about intentionally manufactured and added microplastics. And I think this is one of the important issues of this report. So this, again, this is not specific for nanomaterials nor nanoplastics, but if we look at the next slide, there is a proposed definition for the purpose of the restriction report, or the restriction proposal, I should say, that microplastics means a material consisting of solid polymer containing particles to which and where more than 1% weight of particles have a dimension of, and here's the important part for us, 1 nanometers to 5 millimeters, or fibers a length of 3 nanometers to less than 15 millimeters. So based on the purpose of the definition for the purpose of the restriction proposal of ECHA, nanoscale materials are included in the term microplastics. And we are happy with that. That makes sense. But however, what we have seen, and from these previous slides where a number of clippings from various articles, they just use nanoplastics. And on the next slide, we have a draft, preliminary wording. It's not fully published just yet. We are working on this plastic opinion, the NIA position, I should say, where the take-home message is that from our side, we urge care when referring to degradation of plastics into small particles. As from our view, the nanoplastics is not a specific term, and qualifiers should be considered to avoid confusion and increase clarity. So these qualifiers we need to have, for example, using such as incidental nanoplastics or incidental plastic nanomaterials that are formed by degradation of plastic or from wear. But we also have the issue where, as a manufacturing industry, where we can see manufactured nanoplastics, so plastic nanomaterials that are intentionally produced at the nanoscale to allow for specific product characteristics. And these two uses are, of course, very different. And also, so far, the presence of these manufactured nanoplastics in the environment is expected to be very low to even non-existent, as they would be produced to be incorporated into products. They would be bound in the matrix. So this is a position we expect to make public early next year, but this is just an indication of the preliminary wording that we're using now. We want to make sure that we just don't want to call everything nanoplastics, because that would be misleading. You need some qualifiers, such as incidental or manufactured. That is basically the take-home message from this. Next slide, please. And I think I'm happy to stop talking now after 40 minutes and hand over again to Claire to conclude on the upcoming events that we will see from NIA. And thank you very much.
Thanks
Claire.
very much indeed, David, for, as usual, a really detailed and fascinating insight. And I'm glad that you could live to the end of your slides. So you may go and lay down now, which is fine. So, of course, there's no such thing as a free lunch or a free webinar. So I'm just going to give you a sneaky peek into what NIA has coming up. If I can work my own slides, that will be fine. We're coming to the end of our schedule for 2019 after an incredibly enjoyable year. And we've already got some really delicious things in the pipeline for 2020. So the first thing that you will see in your webinar series coming up is in January, which is something that we're very interested in, which is looking at the use of nanomaterials in dual-use applications. As Europe moves towards a more formal and EU-wide defence research fund, there are already projects underway to look at development of materials for both civil and defence use. And this is a fantastic opportunity to look at how nanomaterials might fit into this, because, as you know, this is very common within areas such as the US, but also in individual EU countries such as France and the UK, but not at EU level. So this is a very nice opportunity to look at a project that's underway currently to produce advanced materials called Westlife, and also look at guidelines for the development of nanomaterials for dual use from uranium. So we hope that you would join us on January the 22nd to find out what these projects are all about and what future opportunities there are for EU organisations in particular to take part in these. And NIA will certainly be supporting its members very much in understanding how it can take part and what the benefits are. Because obviously, while the science often will run in parallel tracks, it brings in really interesting regulatory and standards and market access questions around the commercial development of such materials. So we hope that you would join us for that. You will certainly have heard me talk already about our annual symposium in March, because it is one of our favourite things of the year. And this will bring together most of our members. And this year we're hoping to bring together up to 70 nanomaterials companies and our research centres to talk around key areas of nano that are important. And as we come to the end of Horizon 2020 and look into Horizon Europe, we want to understand more about how the EU is positioning itself, and particularly in the light of the new European Commission that just came into action on December the 1st. So we're entering a very different phase of the EU. So we really want to have a look at how that impacts nanomaterials development and research. We're going to have another look at nanomaterials in dual use, and there we will also be bringing in one of our US members, Sarian, who is very active in defence projects in the US, and so that's a really nice opportunity to look at potential pathways forward for our members. We are also bringing in a session on communicating nano, not just about PR and sales, but look at how companies position nano themselves and nano as a whole. Because as we know, nano is often in a position where there is a trust deficit, to borrow Gregor Schneider's excellent phrase. And so not only do companies have a responsibility to talk about their own materials and technologies, but also to help support the development of the sector as a whole and ensure that it's transparent and widely communicated and available. We are also looking, of course, at all things that link to market access. So we'll be looking at regulation and standards, and we're looking in particular at some of the really interesting tools that are coming out to help address the REACH Annex amendment updates. So that will be very interesting, and we'll be joined by ECHA and other organisations to look at how we address grouping and read across within a regulatory context. And finally, we have our Projects Corner, which we ran successfully for the first time last year, where our members and our guests can bring into our meeting examples of the projects that they are in and bring up materials and pop-up stands. And this is a really nice opportunity to see what is coming out of both safety and innovation research. So if you have not yet registered for the symposium, please do so. It's free for all members and super cheap for non-members, and we'd be really happy to see you in Brussels in March. Finally, the other activities we have coming up, which I haven't included in slides, is, as David mentioned, we have our publication of our position paper on nanoplastics, which we will do in January. So you'll be able to see the full position paper, and we hope to get an interesting conversation going, particularly with the target audience for this position paper, which is researchers, and we will access a lot of researchers through our work with the Nano Safety Cluster. We want to target policymakers, regulatory agencies, and indeed the wider community to make sure that the word nanoplastics is just not used lazily and without context in the future, because engineered nanomaterial producers have worked so hard to ensure that they are transparent and fully informed that this is a risk to undermine their careful work that the nanomaterials industry has undertaken. We will also be launching our Nanotechnology Innovation Council, where each year we speak to our members, particularly our new members, around what innovative or disruptive technologies have supported their own work. So this is not necessarily novel materials coming out, but what is enabling novel nanomaterials. And in the past, we've looked very closely at things like advances in imaging, and we're looking forward to finding out what members are seeing as the most disruptive technologies helping their business development now. But of course, we could talk about this all day, and I'm not going to anymore. So this brings us to the end of our open part of the webinar. And I should just say, I forgot this little thing here, and we'll share this slide with everybody here. David found a really interesting webinar that you should all watch from the UK Royal Institution, and it looks at really fascinating inputs and uses of nanomaterials in everyday life. So we'll share that with everybody so that you can go and watch it. So what we will do now is take a 2-minute pause while our members go and grab a coffee ready for our member discussion and Q&A session, and the rest of you can await with bated breath the recording of the webinar so that you can catch it again. So I'd like again once more to thank David very much for all his efforts and rising from his sickbed to inform everybody today. I'm going to stop recording, and we look forward to seeing you again after Christmas. And have a happy Christmas if we don't speak to you before then.